Hey everyone, this is not a normal episode for my YouTube channel. This is being done for the sake of those who missed a presentation I made on the weekend. So for those of you who don't know, I'm a pastor. I have two churches, and once in a while I get invited out to speak in other places, and that was the case last weekend. And I spoke in the morning in a church in Edmonton, and I spoke in the evening. And the morning one was live streamed and got recorded, and it's available on their YouTube channel. But the second one, something glitched, and it didn't get recorded. And so people weren't able to watch live, and they're not able to go back and watch it after. Several people have asked me for that presentation, and I've decided to do it this way. So if you're not a Seventh-day Adventist, this is going to make less sense to you, but don't leave because of that. If you follow along, you are going to learn something well worth knowing, whether you are raised a Christian or not even raised a Christian. This applies to all people everywhere for all time. In the Bible, in the book of Daniel, it talks about a time of trouble that will come at the end of the world before Jesus returns. Some Christian faiths teach that we will be rescued from this planet before that time comes. The Bible does not teach that. Not that, as far as I understand it, and it just doesn't. The Bible has a strong track record of God walking with us through our trouble, in our trouble, not necessarily rescuing us from our trouble. Even in the powerful stories of rescue, like Daniel in the lion's den, or his three friends who were thrown in the fiery furnace, two very commonly known stories, even in those two stories, those men experienced being thrown into the trouble before they experienced the rescue from the trouble. In other words, God didn't whisk them away so they never faced the decision of having to go into the trouble. They went into the trouble. They literally went into the furnace not knowing what was going to happen next. Daniel went literally into the den of lions not knowing what would happen next. But God was with all of them in their situations, and he walked with them in it and through it, and they came out the other side. When the Bible talks about this great time of trouble, it says that Jesus will stand up to deliver his people. So yes, there will be a time of great trouble at the end of time, but we will not be abandoned. We will be rescued. It will be the ultimate rescue. It will be the final rescue, and we will go home. Sometimes that time of trouble is referred to as Jacob's time of trouble. So I did a thing. I went on Google Images, and I typed in Jacob's time of trouble, just to see what would pop up. And many of the images, if not most of the images, were fear-inducing images. Images of planet on fire. I'll post some of them. I'll get my son, he edits, I'll get him to post some of the pictures. But the time of Jacob's trouble is actually an event in the Bible. It's a story. It happened to Jacob. Jacob is the grandson of Abraham. So you have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And the time of Jacob's trouble is the night where he was on his way back to face the brother he had betrayed, the brother who wanted to kill him. And he was alone. He had sent everyone on ahead of him with gifts to appease his brother, etc. And spent the night alone, ended up wrestling with an unknown assailant. And that wrestling is called the time of Jacob's trouble. Well, it ended well. Let's make that point first. The time of Jacob's personal struggle and trouble ended well. It seems like, for some reason, we are more drawn to, pulled in by, consumed with bad news, fear, terror, than we are at looking at the big picture and going, well, there was some bad stuff in that part, but it ended really well. So the time of Jacob's trouble ended well. The time of our trouble will end well. The only variable in the story of Jacob, how it could have been different, which we are about to explore, and in our own story and how it's going to play out, is how we view God and ourselves during the struggle. So for those of you not familiar with Jacob's story, let me summarize it as quickly as I can. When Rebekah was about to have her baby, she was having all kinds of problems. It was like there was a war going on inside of her womb. And God told her that she was going to have twins and that they were going to have some problems between themselves. And in the end, the younger would rise above the older, which is unusual. That's not how the culture was designed to be. The oldest got the inheritance. He got the farm. He got the name. He got the legacy. It all went to the oldest. But she was told before he was born that the younger would rise above the older. Let me make one point here. If you tune out or if you don't make it all the way through, you get disrupted, whatever the reason, if you don't make it through the rest, let me make this point right here, right now, and you can take it with you. When God tells us how things are going to be, that's what he's doing. He's telling us how it's going to be. He's not telling us this is how we need to make it be. He's telling us it's how it's going to be. And there is an infinite difference between the two. Rebekah took what God said as a responsibility on herself, that she somehow needed to arrange things in such a way that the younger would rise above the older. God never told her to do that. He told her the younger would rise above the older. He's just opening up the future before her and saying, this is how it's going to go. But she didn't see it that way. Again, if you're following my regular YouTube episodes, there are two stories in the Bible. There's God's story, and there's Satan's twisting of the story, and the two have been in conflict since the Garden of Eden. And Rebekah, human as she was, took God's revelation on as a responsibility. And she began to try and arrange things in such a way in their home and family life that Jacob would rise above Esau. So instead of telling Jacob, this is what God is going to do for you, Jacob was raised under the idea of this is what you must become. Again, there is an infinite difference between the two. One is a promise from God that is immutable. The other is pressure on us to rise up to some impossible place that we just can't attain to. So one day, Esau, the older brother, came home from hunting and he was famished, and Jacob was the homeboy and he was in the process of making himself a meal. And Esau wanted some of his food, which tells you right away that the relationship between them wasn't great, because if it was, Jacob would have offered him the food. Instead, Jacob saw an opportunity to advance himself in this struggle to get above his brother. Esau fell for it. He's like, man, I'm starving to death. Like, what good is my inheritance to me, my blessing to me, my birthright to me if I die of starvation? So they made the deal. Esau said, give me this food, you can have my birthright. Of course, you know how it is. When we're in a corner, we make promises that we have no intention of keeping, and Esau didn't keep this one. So later on, Isaac, the dad, called Esau in and said, I want you to go hunting, and I want you to get some wild game, bring it back, make the stew that I love, and I will give you your blessing. I'm going to transfer the blessing that came to me from Abraham, from God. I'm going to transfer it to you. Rebekah overhears, and she sets in motion a plan whereby Jacob is going to disguise himself to look like Esau, to feel like Esau, to sound like Esau, to provide the meal that Esau was to provide, and to get the blessing that was meant for Esau. And they carry out the plan. Again, taking it upon themselves to accomplish what God already said would be. When Esau finds out what they've done, he basically said, when Dad dies, you're dead. I will kill you. Now Rebecca has a new dilemma. I've obtained the blessing underhandedly for my son, my youngest son, who's supposed to rise above his brother. But what good is the blessing if he's dead? So she goes to Isaac and she says, honey, Esau has married. He didn't make a wise choice. It's not one of our people. I don't want that to happen to Jacob. Let's send Jacob home to our people so he can find a good wife who believes in God like we do, etc., etc. Lying and manipulating. What she really meant was, we got to get our son out of here before his brother kills him. When we take it upon ourselves through the false messaging of religion to try and become, on our own, through our own means, what God has promised to do for us, we don't just fail to become what he said we could become. We make a royal mess. Jacob leaves. The very first night that he is away from home, in his sleep, he has a vision from God. And in that vision, God tells him that the blessing of Abraham is upon him. And then he adds a personal note to the blessing, saying, wherever you go, I will be with you, and I will bring you back to this place that you've just fled away from for fear of Esau. I will bring you back here in peace. Well, how's he going to do that? The only human way to imagine that would be possible is that Esau somehow would die or leave, and then Esau could come back to the land in peace. The very next thing that happens in that encounter between God and Jacob, Jacob names the place Bethel, the house of God. He puts up a rock, a shrine, because he's learned that from the culture, to mark the spot, to remember it. And then he says, and this is key, he says, if you provide, because Jacob has left with nothing. He has nothing. He has the clothes on his back, the staff in his hand, he has nothing. If you provide food for me, and if you provide clothing for me, and a place to live and take care of me, then you will be my God. In other words, Jacob has been raised in a quote-unquote Christian home, a God-fearing home, a God-loving, believing home, theoretically. But he hasn't himself decided that the God of his parents and the God of Abraham is his God. And if you're parents and you're watching this, you cannot transfer your faith to your children. They do not inherit it by genetics. They do not inherit it by environment. It's a choice they have to make. And it's a relationship that God himself will undertake with them. And if you look back on your own experience, you'll know that God did that for you, and he'll do it for them. It's not our job as parents to make our children believe in God. It's our job to be faithful to God and to introduce them to God. The rest of the journey is their own. Let them take it. So Jacob says, God, if you do all these things you've promised for me, then you'll be my God. So fast forward, he goes to the land of his parents' heritage. He ends up at his uncle's house, ends up marrying his cousin, Rachel. And ends up marrying the sister first, actually. That's a whole messy story that is not part of this. We don't have time for it. You can go and read it in Genesis. And his uncle Laban is also a manipulator and a cheater and a person who's trying to advance his own cause and using Jacob to do it. And finally, after 20-ish years, Jacob has had enough, and God comes to him and says, "It's time for you to go home. I will be with you, and you will go home in peace." To his credit, Jacob has enough faith in God at that point to start for home. But the closer he gets, the more fearful he becomes. Fear and faith cannot coexist. There is a portion of time where they'll fight against each other, but ultimately they cannot coexist. Either we will capitulate to fear, or we will hold on to faith, ultimately. When you read the encounter of Jacob that leads into his night of wrestling with this unknown assailant, you can feel the tension. You can read the words where he expresses the inner tension. He's like trying to rationalize, how is it that you've been so faithful to me? How is it that you've made all these promises to me, yet I'm about to die? Esau is going to kill me. I don't see how you could possibly make this work out in my favor. Messengers have already come back to me to tell me that 400 men are coming with him. How is this ever going to work? Fear and faith are hammering against each other. On the one hand, he can look back at his life and go, God has been good to me. God has brought me safely to this moment. God has led me to where I am. God has foretold that it's all going to go well, but it can't possibly go well because my brother hates me, said he was going to kill me, and he's coming with 400 soldiers. And so he falls into a fitful sleep alone, facing the weight of the bad decisions and the guilt and the shame of his past. It is the time of Jacob's personal hell. When the unknown assailant comes, and the wrestling begins, at some point in that wrestling, Jacob recognized that he was fighting God. And his assailant said, "Morning is coming, I have to leave." Now there's a whole theme, and I'm not going to get into it in this presentation, of night and day and morning and evening and sun rising and sun setting. Jacob, the day is about to break for Jacob. He is about to go all in with God. The day is breaking. And Jacob holds on to his assailant, and he says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The question, "I will not let you go," or the plea, "I will not let you go unless you bless me," shows that he knows who it is. But it also shows something else. That Jacob is fighting to obtain the blessing still. And here is the point of the message. Do not miss the point. Jacob had the blessing before he was born. Jacob personally received the blessing from God the first night that he left home, trying to escape the mess that he created. When Jacob was called to go return home, the blessing was restated to him. The night before he fell asleep in this fitful sleep that ended up in this wrestling match, He stated himself, I know you've blessed me. I know you've been with me. I know you've done everything you said you would do except for this one last thing. And I don't see how you can pull this off. And faith and fear just hammered against each other. It was the night of Jacob's personal time of trouble, his personal hell. I will not let you go unless you bless me, which could be rewritten as, I will not let you go unless you re-give me what you've already given me. Don't you see it? Don't you see? Every time that you fear that you can never be good enough for God, you're fighting to obtain what you already have. Not because you are good enough in the moment. Jacob wasn't safe from his brother in that moment. Not in any human sense. All he had to go on was that God had promised. All you have to go on and all I have to go on is that God has promised. Jesus said, with man, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. In Philippians 1:6, he said, he that has begun a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. The promises are there. God cannot give us the blessing. It's already been given. But the blessing does not benefit us. There's no peace that comes with the blessing until we believe that we have the blessing. God has promised us that we will rise above the one who dominates this planet. God has promised us that he will crush the serpent's head. God has promised us that he will bring us home. God has promised us that he can fit us for heaven. God has promised us that he will give us a robe that makes us able to walk into the king's wedding feast. God has promised everything that we could possibly ever imagine that we could ever need. The real time of trouble that's coming is not what may happen out there. The real time of trouble that's coming is when we see how close we are to our King returning, and we look inside ourselves and we look back at the mess of our life that we've made and the bad decisions and the guilt and the shame and the fear, and we wonder, can he really, really keep his promise? His track record to this point says, yes, he can, and yes, he will. God bless.